There are many different ways to look at the issues related to how the U.S. engages in the world, both through their arms and through their military assistance. So most recently, we've been seeing since September 2nd that the U.S. military has been engaged in using its resources to actually target who they claim are alleged narco terrorists. That terminology doesn't actually have any legal significance, but what we know is that the trafficking of drugs is a criminal issue for law enforcement. But since September 2nd, the U.S. has been targeting vessels that it alleges carries materials from narco terrorists with strikes, with boat strikes. So at this point in time, there have been over 208 people killed by these strikes and over 65 vessels that have been struck. Now, the U.S. is talking about this as if we are at war with these narco terrorists and that the Caribbean and East Pacific is a battlefield. What Amnesty has been looking at and many other organizations is, in fact, there's no war. This is not an international humanitarian law context. What we have is a law enforcement activity that is being implemented by the U.S. military. It's being done in a way that violates international law. So how we've been framing so that people understand most clearly is that when there's law enforcement involved in an operation, they cannot use lethal force unless there is a direct threat, and there is not a less extreme means to address it. And so when you use lethal use of force outside of those contexts, it's an extrajudicial killing. So what we're seeing is the U.S. military is acting as judge and executioner and conducting extrajudicial killings, a form of murder in the Caribbean and East Pacific. They're doing this at the same time that they're expanding their military partnerships with a number of countries in the region to also combat international or transnational criminal networks, including those engaged in narco trafficking. So we've been watching what's happening, for example, in Ecuador, where there have been joint military operations. We're also looking at the expansion of relationships, including in Guatemala and other places, and a new network across the region called the Shield of the Americas, where the U.S. military is deepening its relationship with all of these countries. And at the launch of the Shield of America, Stephen Miller actually told the generals in the room to ignore the lawyers and that human rights actually don't apply to, that he doesn't care about the human rights of the people that they're targeting. He only cares about lawful, peaceful citizens. So these are kind of the issues that we're looking at in the Western Hemisphere that overlap both with the direct U.S. engagement of the military, but also the U.S.'s relationship with militaries across the region, both in training and sharing of resources, weapons, and defense material.
You've mentioned how, you've had 208 people to date killed by the strikes in September, over 65 strikes that have taken place, right? And this rhetoric in the US and Stephen Miller mentioning that essentially ignore lawyers, ignore human rights. What about the reporting on this issue, particularly in the United States? What are your views on how this egregious abuse of power is being handled in the media and reported on?
It's a great question. And so we have, what it is that the U.S. is engaging in directly, and then the questions of kind of how the U.S. is engaging with other militaries and either training or trying to create the space for other militaries to follow suit. So in the United States, the boat strikes in the Caribbean and East Pacific have gotten quite a bit of coverage in a way that is quite helpful. Members of Congress are now quite concerned. In particular, in December, we learned that the very first boat strike on September 2nd was what is considered a double tap strike. So there was an original strike. There were survivors. The reports are that they survived anywhere from 35 to 45 minutes, at which point in time there was a second strike that was ordered by what we've heard is ordered by either Pete Hegseth or a high-ranking general to actually finish the job and kill the two survivors. So there is a video of this that many people in Congress, many people in the press, and in the international human rights community have been asking to have that video released because the public deserves to see it and deserves to understand exactly what occurred. But then since September 2nd and the release of the information around the September 2nd report or incident, there's been a growing drumbeat of concern that these are unlawful attacks. And as I said, they are a form of murder. As we see it, it's a form of murder as policy. And there have been a number of high visibility oversight questions and hearings in Congress where members of Congress have asked both Secretary Hegseth and Secretary Rubio about these strikes. What is clear is that they are shrouded in a lack of transparency, including what are the targeting decisions and the targeting criteria. Most recently, we've learned that neither the presence of drugs nor the presence of arms are a part of that targeting criteria. So we don't know who the people are that are being killed or why they're being targeted for being alleged drug traffickers.
Turning now to the Middle East, what rights violations and concerns do you have about Israeli actions in Gaza and the West Bank and US support to those?
Well, it's a really difficult question to unpack. So, there are a number of ways to understand how the US should be implementing human rights and humanitarian law policies or safeguards within their both security assistance relationships and their arms transfers and sales. So, in 2023, when the war on Gaza began after October 7th, what we had in place was something called the Conventional Arms Transfer Policy under the Biden administration, which raised particular concerns that U.S. should not be transferring arms to any context where there's a more likely than not standard that there might be human rights or humanitarian law violations occurring. So we had some policy behind us. We also had something that was recently implemented within the State Department called the Civilian Harm Incident Reporting Guidance, where the State Department had a mechanism by which there were U.S. Origin weapons that were involved in a potential human rights or humanitarian law violation, that they could be investigated, and it may lead to different types of policy outcomes, including the suspension of transfer of arms. At the same time, there were a number of civilian harm mitigation and response mechanisms being put in place in the Pentagon. So we had the perfect environment to be able to go to the US government and say that we are seeing some risks that there are US origin weapons, more likely than not being used in the context of humanitarian law violations, and there should be policy responses to address that. And instead, as the evidence mounted, and it mounted very quickly, that we were seeing violations from everything from lack of distinction and proportionality, a lack of effective advanced notice before or warning before there were civilian infrastructure being targeted. And over time, the pattern became so extreme that we saw that there were U.S. origin weapons and other defense material being used in not only humanitarian law violations, but we see a pattern that Amnesty actually found these were acts of genocidal acts, and there was the underlying intent. And so the U.S. and since being put on notice for now almost 3 years that their weapons were being used to advance what we believe is a genocide, the U.S. has actually not taken any steps to prevent the transfer of weapons. Instead, we saw both under the Biden administration and under the Trump administration fast tracking. In fact, having a number of weapon sales or transfers noticed to Congress, and then overriding congressional holds to make sure that those transfers go forward without the oversight mechanisms that many of us have fought for Congress to have over many years.
You mentioned this mechanism, the civilian harm incident reporting guidance. In the context of Iran, the war in Iran, what can you tell us about harm to civilians you and your colleagues have observed as a result of US involvement in this particular conflict?
Yeah, it's a heartbreaking but important question. So, we documented on the very first day of the US and Israel war on Iran a civilian harm case, the case of the girls' school in Manab, where we believe that the US acted in serious breach of international law in failing to take all available precautions, all reasonable precautions to not strike a civilian infrastructure. And we were able to come to that conclusion based on mixed methodology. We use satellite imagery, looking at satellite imagery for over a decade to see what are the changes to the infrastructure of the school to signal that it was no longer being used as in a military facility, but that it had transformed into a school facility. And the clear indications were there as early as 2016. So we looked at satellite imagery, we looked at government data, we actually talked to a number of people with direct knowledge of the Manab area and came to the determination that the US government should have and could have gathered the correct information to determine that this school was not, in fact, a part of the military installation and that they failed to take the necessary precautions to not strike the school. What we do know is that the school was struck with a precision weapon. Therefore, it wasn't an errant weapon. It was, in fact, a targeting decision that was made. And whether or not there were any mistakes made in the targeting decisions, that is something that we want an investigation. We know that there is an investigation underway in the Pentagon. It's been nearly 4 months that hasn't been released. We also want to know within that investigation whether or not artificial intelligence was used at all in the targeting decisions or the intelligence collection, at what point it was used, and what any sort of errors there might have been. So we want a full and complete picture of what went wrong and for there to be accountability for the errors that were made. And if in fact there was recklessness that raised to the level of criminal liability, that people be held accountable for that.
What do you think is still misunderstood when it comes to all of these conflicts that we've discussed, and in particular, the harm to civilians factor?
There's so much. So I am a human rights generalist. I was not kind of deeply steeped in either arms or humanitarian law. And the vast majority of my career, I really understand the human rights infrastructure. I understand how to conduct human rights investigations and think about human rights law and how to hold people accountable for violations. When you get into the context where that you are in conflict or you engaging with the military, it's a different set of laws that govern primarily with humanitarian law human rights law providing some additional guidance. But humanitarian law is different in the sense that it was written by generals. It was written by the military coming out of a particularly dark period of the global history. It was coming out of World War II, and they wrote many laws that gave them the broadest scope possible to fight wars. But they gave themselves some limited guideposts so that the atrocities that occurred during the Second World War were not repeated. And the primary purpose of those guardrails are not to prevent all civilians from being harmed or being killed. It's to lessen the amount of harm that comes to civilians. So it's unfortunate, but international humanitarian law recognizes that people, including, quote, innocent people, civilian children, will die in war. And that is very hard for a human rights activist to really understand. So if we know that people will die in war, that militaries will kill people that are not combatants, and that makes the investigation of what happens when there is a civilian death very complicated. And it means that there's a very high bar when an organization like Amnesty says that there is something that should be investigated as a war crime or that there's been a breach of international law. It's because we have a very high level of certainty that even within the permissiveness of the laws of war, something has gone wrong that violates those protections. And I think that is something that is not as well understood about this area of documentation and human rights advocacy, is that we are operating within an environment of very high standards for determining that we need to say or do something because the laws have been breached in a particular way.